Forbidden History, Chapter 2. Alexa, take us to the land of promise. The Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, had Thanksgiving with the Indians, and lived happily ever after. The end, right? Not really. Not how it went down. William Bradford and his posse of pilgrims set sail with the plans of landing on an uninhabited island with a tiny Dutch trading post on its southern point. This island was called York City, now New York City, or Manhattan today. At least that was their plan when they set out on their journey. But as I've heard it said, you want to make God laugh? Tell him your plans. Thanks to an inconvenient storm, one of many out of nowhere and perfectly timed weather events directing the traffic of history, that blew them off course, they actually made landfall at Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And while they were extremely thankful to have made it to the Americas alive, they had a big problem. They had run completely out of beer. This was a crisis of epic proportion among the crew of weary seagoers. They were thirsty. Seawater was not an option because it will kill you or make you insane if consumed. Land water would typically, unless you happened upon a flowing spring, be laden with parasites, making one ill and resulting in death. Beer, well, it was safe, sanitary, and tasted better to these Protestant travelers looking for respite. Our country was founded on beer, blood, guts, and guns. But besides being out of booze, they were in the wrong spot. They would later find out just how good a spot it was. So in typical human ego fashion, they set sail again for what should have been a 4 to 5 day journey down the Hudson River to their original destination. As luck would have it, however, the weather, the tides, God, and a strong headwind had different plans. They decided to take this second failed attempt as a sign from God and return to Cape Cod. There, they found what they thought to be an abandoned, uninhabited Indian settlement that looked like its previous tenants had packed up and left the day before. What they did not learn until much later was the entire village had been wiped out by disease. They also took this as a sign of tremendous providential blessing, a divinely prepped place to begin anew. Then one day in March of 1621, a random native came wandering out of the woods, approaching their settlement, quickly and with a purpose. Of course, they were pretty freaked out by him and the manner in which he boldly came upon them. He shouted, "Welcome, Englishmen!" Can you imagine the looks on their faces? Again, with hurried steps, he gestured to them, repeating, "Welcome, Englishmen!" To their amazement, he then added the question, "Do you have beer?" Drink first, talk later. You gotta love this curious Indian, though I hope he never shows up at my house. As a home brewer, I doubt I'd ever get him to leave. Turned out his name was Samoset, and he loved his beer a lot. But it also happened he knew an Indian by the name of Tisquantum, whom they called Squanto. Squanto was of a more sober constitution and knew much better English than Samoset. Probably spoke better, too, without the slurs and all. Squanto was originally from the very same village that had been wiped out by plague where the Pilgrims landed. He was 12 years old when he was abducted from the village by an English sea captain. He spent 9 years in London, escaped, and made a long ocean voyage to return to his people. But upon returning to the American continent, he was kidnapped again After months at sea and landing in Spain, the second captain who abducted him was pressed by Spanish monks to sell Squanto to them for a reduced price. These monks helped him return to his familiar England. While living with a merchant family, he learned better English. He would again, crossing the Atlantic a fourth time, attempt to get home. Arriving in Cape Cod approximately 6 months before the Pilgrims and the Mayflower, he came to find not one living soul in his village. He had learned from a neighboring group of natives that his entire tribe had all perished from disease, most likely contracted from early traders. English, French, Spanish, Portuguese? Who knows? They all were selling, and having carnal relations with those residing on the continent. Squanto was the only Patuxet Indian to survive. Most historians believe it was either smallpox or chickenpox that raged for 3 years, decimating Squanto's people. What does Squanto have to do with the Pilgrims? Turns out his abductions not only saved his life, but would save the Pilgrims as well. His time with the Spanish and English made him the most valuable asset the European immigrant Protestants could have possibly prayed for. They found cultivated land in their new home, but did not know what it could sustain, let alone how to grow it. This Indian did. Many early European settlements dissolved for lack of food. Prior colonies saw their inhabitants actually run off to join bands of Indians to save themselves from starvation. The Pilgrims would suffer no such fate, thanks to the generosity and knowledge of this Indian Squanto. But I have to ask you, the reader, what are the chances a single Indian would be abducted, his entire village wiped out? He, a lone survivor, returns and saves the very people who found his ancestral home uninhabited and were themselves on the verge of starvation. I don't know what to make of that, but I find it interesting. Aside from starving to death, previous colonists perished from Indian attacks, but these Pilgrims somehow managed to happen upon the only Indian who could not only cultivate good relations by his linguistic skills between them and the surrounding tribes, but also, thanks to the agricultural skills he learned from his time in Europe, taught them how to properly plant corn with 3 fish. He saved them from being murdered by neighbors and ensured they would not perish from starvation, so typical of others. When Squanto fell gravely ill, he begged the governor to pray for him so he could go to the Englishman's God in heaven, and later died. William Bradford said, "His death was a great loss." Many educators insist early Europeans did nothing but bully, kill, steal, and massacre the native population in the Americas during these centuries. But if we take an honest look at history, we will discover that among the many atrocities and violence that erupted between Europeans and native Indians, there were also plenty of stories of peace, compassion, cooperation, and generosity. Many of the American Indian tribes fought each other, enslaved one another, and jockeyed for power centuries before Europeans, who were busy doing the same thing to each other in Europe, ever dropped anchor in the West. But it is true that some of the first Catholic faces to appear were, in their gold fever, terribly brutal to the American North, Central, and Southern natives. But I guess that's what happens when people practice Islamic traditions under the banner of Catholicism. But religious justifications aside, it really just comes down to men's obsession with gold. Wealth and power have driven many a person and peoples to do horrible acts throughout history. This has always been and will ever be. The truth about the Pilgrims is the founding example of our nation. Their Mayflower Compact became the ipso facto basis of principles of what the future country would become. Our founders framed the idea of America around the Christian virtues these religious refugees established. Or as David Horowitz wrote, "But America was created as a secular republic precisely because of the Christian beliefs of its religious founders, specifically their Protestant Christian beliefs." Dark Agenda, page 39. These Christian Protestants seeking religious freedom in the New World could never have envisioned what their posterity would invoke. Those who established a nation which called upon God in every and all public meetings, festivities, and events would, in time, not even allow him a seat at a high school football game. These early Americans would be horrified to see their descendants changing history to make the past conform to the present. Even today, the Pilgrims are being labeled as newcomers, early settlers, or European colonizers, or being scrubbed from the historical record entirely, as done by the New Jersey Department of Education in 2002. Such actions are not merited for references to Allah, Mother Earth, or any other non-Christian deity. Interesting to ponder how attached their religious beliefs were to the secular freedoms they established, and how, as we today eradicate the one, the other seemingly falls with it. I have heard it repeated over and over by many a mouth that Christianity is responsible for the worst of religious mass murder in world history. This is bad history and a terrible, inaccurate overgeneralization. To analyze this accusation, we must first look at some specifics. Christianity, even back then, as it is now, was made up of different countries and different groups. What I find of particular historical significance is the majority of the genocide committed against native peoples, as Howard Zinn constantly rambles about, particularly in Central and South America, were mostly committed by Spanish Catholics. This fact isn't being rendered as an excuse to the English, Dutch, Russian, or French atrocities, but we are, for the sake of this accusation, talking about the worst and the bulk amount of. So why would this be of any importance to this popular stereotype of European violence and opposition? Well, when Europe was struggling to oust the Muslim hordes that had invaded and ruled, they managed to oust them from most the continent, except one country. In this country, they had a strong foothold and managed to stay in control and in power almost 300 years after the rest of Europe was liberated and under Christian rule. Yes, that country was Spain. And yes, eventually, they also converted to Catholicism. But conversion notwithstanding, one should ask oneself this question. After reflecting on the jihad, religious war, conquest, obsession with slavery, subjugation of women and conquered people that was so prevalent in Islam and its cruelty, is it possible its influence remained ingrained in the minds, society, and culture of the Spanish? Only under the new banner of Catholicism? I don't know. You, the reader, can decide. But I find the connection terribly interesting nonetheless. As Michael Medved says in his book, The American Miracle, more than 150 years passed before the descendants of New England's founders finally united with other English colonists to challenge an empire and achieve independence. The passage of 5 generations meant profound changes in wealth, values, occupations, communication, political philosophy, and even theology among the thriving provinces of 18th century England, English America. But one characteristic consistently connected the Pilgrims of 1620 and the Patriots of 1776: an unshakable conviction in their own significance as part of a divinely ordained design for their country. In short, even 5 generations later, the majority of the colonies believed God was steering their destinies as individuals and the collective. Page 46. While Medved is correct, I would also add there was a smaller conglomerate living right alongside these Americans of faith, a more secular one at best, and a shadier old world type at worst. What had begun with the Pilgrims' fervent belief that God was in control of their nation had grown into a wildfire of a popular matter of fact by 1776. Contrary to Medved's point of view, Howard Zinn's Marxist Communist Socialist book, A People's History of the United States, insists the founders' motivation to pursue independence rested solely on racial hatred. Quote, with England victorious over France in the 7 Years' War, ambitious colonial leaders were no longer threatened by the French. They now had 2 rivals left, English and the Indians. Once the British were out of the way, the Indians could be dealt with. Page 59 and 60. Maybe Mr. Zinn knows something about our founders no other historian has yet discovered. But I can find little evidence of such a claim from the ample amounts of historical writings left behind. Let's discuss historians for a moment. Sir Walter Besant once said, "It is easier to make history than it is to write it. That is not so difficult to conduct battle as it is to describe one." It is very difficult to write about history. Very few have the talent, as Dr. Benson Lossing did, to state facts accurately while filling them with charm and interest. I hope one day to achieve, through adequate practice, a quarter of Lossing's historical and literary talents. Ultimately, the story can only be as honest as the person writing it. I've studied and read dozens of biographies and books about the founders' lives, and I have never witnessed any indication this prognosis of Zinn's as being part of their grand design. History is vitally important to the health and longevity of a society, but history can sometimes be difficult to grasp when disinformation runneth over. It is, in fact, like us in many ways, always available for revision or correction. It can be changed, altered, fictionalized, taken out of context, ignored, removed, and perverted. But if we choose to abandon it altogether and pretend as if it is not relevant, we do so at our own peril. One can read into history and historical peoples and see the shadows that sometimes do not exist, particularly when your higher education were lessons and instructions from radical Marxist professors. I did not receive Zen's education indoctrination, but I did spend as many years in historical self-study as it takes most pre-med students to become surgical specialists. If you want to understand Zen's book and those like him, you must understand these two words: critical pedagogy. What's that? Critical pedagogy. Definition: is a philosophy of education and social movement that has developed and applied concepts from critical theory and relative traditions to the field of education and the study of culture. Advocates of critical pedagogy pedagogy view teaching as an inherently political act, reject the neutrality of knowledge, and insist that issues of social justice and democracy itself are not distinct from acts of teaching and learning. The goal of critical pedagogy is emancipation from oppression through an awakening of the critical consciousness. When achieved, critical consciousness encourages individuals to effect change in their world through social critique and political action. There it is. Translation: education's sole purpose, in this case history, is to create political change, promote social justice, which is rarely just, and affect change. It means teaching is and should essentially be political activism, a complete reversal of traditional understanding of instruction and what a teacher used to be. Joy Pullman's book, Education Invasion, sheds important light on this particular subject and should be read by every parent. But this, however, is what the Zens of the world, as well as many of the higher education elites, adhere to and are committed to. This is the same author, after all, that claims American slavery to be, quote, the most cruel form of slavery in history, unquote. What? Go read about the Jews in Egypt, the Christians in Rome, and the entire history of Muhammad's Islam, and ask yourself if you agree with Zen's opinion. I am not attempting to demean or deface the very evil and cruel reality of American slavery, mind you. I seek to put statements from those like Zen and others into proper context, without the political propaganda they insert into the past. No rational, let alone godly, individual would say any slavery in any history, particularly American slavery, was good by any means. But it would be more honest if people stopped referring to slavery as America's original sin, since America neither created nor brought slavery upon itself. The United States, America, in fact, did not exist when slavery's oppressive tentacles stretched across the colonies. Context and honesty would incline us to admit that many European countries and other people brought back slavery to this continent long before the American experiment was even a thought in any colonist's coconut. Slavery, at least the physical sort, unlike today, was accepted during its height and was propagated by the English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and others. Why it was continued after the Revolution of 1776 we will address in the next chapter. To understand who these rebels to king and country were, we had to understand those that came before them. America was about to begin a birth of freedom, yet known or realized ever before in world history. Was it about to be a birth of evil intent or biblical prophecy realized? I don't know. I'm just driving this thing. I didn't build the car or pave the road. But let's see where it leads anyhow. And here's a quote by Alan Bloom from The Closing of the American Mind. We need history not to tell us what happened or to explain the past, but to make the past come alive so that it can explain us and make a future possible. This is our educational crisis and opportunity.